I can still see it in my mind's eye. Over 100 teenagers singing with passion, singing until their voices are sore, some even swaying with hands raised upwards. God is doing something exciting. After the time of singing, a speaker walks on stage. You can hear a pin drop. The audience sits and listens transfixed, soaking in the speaker's words about God's love, forgiveness, and God's plan for each one of them. Yes, even them. The energy is quiet, but palpable. And when the speaker finishes with a heartfelt, honest prayer, he ushers the band back on stage. The energy becomes loud once again. When the service is over, we walk out of the meeting room, smiles on our faces, and a joyful desire in our hearts to go out and conquer the world. Can you relate to what I am talking about here? Perhaps not this specific scene, but something similar. Many of us, I imagine, can go back to a time in our past that we would call a spiritual mountaintop experience. For me, these memories come from my times primarily at a Christian camp in the mountains of New York State. This is a camp I attended several times each year while in middle school and high school. It was a place I truly felt God's love and spirit. The energy was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. And not just the high energy in that scene that I described a moment ago, but elsewhere too, whether it was in the music or the talks, or even walking around the property at the snack bar or the ropes course, or even in the quiet seclusion of my favorite rock as I gazed out at the camp's mirror lake. I felt God's love just in the air. It was working through those around me, and that place had experienced so much of that over the years that I truly think even the rocks shall sing. That was true here. It was as though the place was alive. At the end of every week or weekend retreat, I felt re-energized, ready to go and serve God in my everyday life at home. The trouble was, when I would return home, the world, shockingly, always seemed less exciting somehow, less promising than it had on my mountaintop. Why can't every day be like it was at camp, I used to wonder. Teenage me did not feel the presence of the holy in the same way when doing her homework and her chores and her everyday routines. The yearning would start all over again for that feeling, and I would be counting the days until my next trip, my next spiritual high. This is actually a known phenomenon in youth ministry and in all forms of ministry. Experiences like retreats or times away or mission trips allow Christians to experience life and faith in a different way. Jesus models this too, and I've spoken about this before, this anakoreo in the Greek, the withdrawing to a different place to experience the holy, only to then get back into the fray of normal life. The time away is a deeply holy and transformative time. But if not followed up upon with a consistent home church experience, there's a tendency for people new to the faith in particular to simply crave that next high, that next mountaintop. We see it in our passage this morning too. This here is a picture from the Church of the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor in Israel that I took when I was there in early 2020. Jesus and his three closest companions retreat to a mountain to pray. Something unusual happens there, something mystical. Jesus starts glowing, dazzlingly white. Moses and Elijah show up then and converse with Jesus about things that have not yet taken place. The disciples look on, awestruck. They are on holy ground, and they know it. Moses and Elijah finish their chat with Jesus and start to take their leave. Then Peter, as is his way, puts his foot in it. A more charitable read would say that Peter gives voice to his inner desires and probably the desires of everyone present. He wants to stay. He wants to camp out on that mountain and not just linger for a final glimpse. Peter wants to take up a residence there. Master, it is good for us to be here, Peter tells Jesus. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. There's a draw to the spiritual mountaintop. It's rare to come close to holiness. Rarer still to be alert enough to actually notice that. Peter wants to camp out there forever if he could. And if we're honest about it, so do we. Beloved children of God, how often do we just want to cling to holiness? Sometimes it is a place, a certain spot that meant a lot to you in your past, like my camp. Sometimes it is a place. Sometimes it is a person. That charismatic pastor who captured your heart at one point, or the quiet saint who worked their way into your spirit in a manner that felt otherworldly, or the parent or spouse or child with whom you have a deeply holy connection. Sometimes it's a person, sometimes it's an experience. Feeling close to God while walking, or skiing, or painting, or making music. Sometimes it's an experience, sometimes it's a spiritual practice. Reading the scriptures, or praying first thing in the morning, or opening up that devotional consistently, or finding a time at the end of the day to name gratitude before extinguishing the bedside lamp at night. We all tap into the holy in different ways, and sometimes we want to hold tightly to these holy places, people, experiences, and practices. So we're going to do something a little different right now. I can figure out how to work Zoom. Yes. We are going to take some time in small groups in this space to speak a bit about your holy experiences. So I invite you to think for a moment and share with your group about a place, a person, an experience, or a spiritual practice that has been filled with holiness for you. What has been your mountaintop? We'll split up into groups of 2, and we'll take about 7 minutes to do this. So I invite you to please right size your sharing. Each person will have about 2 to 3 minutes to share. This is just like turning in your pew to chat with the person next to you, right? And when the time is up, I will bring you back in here. So I'm going to send you off into groups, and please be mindful. Feel free to unmute yourself when you get into those groups. Okay. Okay, I think we're back. How was this experience for you all? And this is not rhetorical. I'm not waxing poetic as your preacher this morning. I'd love to hear from you all. So feel free to unmute and share. How was it to hear about each other's holy places, people, experiences, practices?
I thought it was wonderful.
That's interesting. Melissa, I found it interesting as well. Melissa and I had a very nice discussion, and it was interesting to see she found hers in a group setting with many other people experiencing the same experience. And I found mine literally on a mountaintop with solitude and nobody else around. And that opposite was just interesting to me and to Melissa, that we both had experiences, but completely opposite in the nature of how they were experienced.
I love that, Ed. Thank you. Yeah, this comes in really different packaging for different people, right?
Yeah, kind of echoing what Ed said there. Our experiences seem to be, contemplative things by yourself. Large group settings that we were doing things in, places we went to. it was a whole mix. So just a reminder that experiencing the holy can't be confined to just one little thing or one
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. And, when we try to, this is something I have a challenge in worship services, when we try to craft a holy experience by God's grace, it looks really different. What I might find meaningful is not what someone else would find meaningful, and vice versa. Yeah.
I find great peace in just being in my yard, sitting in the backyard, listening to the pond, the waterfalls,
Mm.
working in the garden, stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's just very peaceful to me.
So that image of Jesus going off and being by himself in nature with a very select few others in this story, but often by himself. That sounds like it tracks for you. Thanks.
Yep.
Any other final wonderings about this?
So Deb and I and Barbara had a conversation, and we had a commonality in that it was also in nature. And Audrey, I totally appreciate that. For Barbara, and sorry to speak for you, it was out in birch trees and hearing the wind come through and just the peacefulness of that. For Deb and I, well, Deb and I have separate ones, but for me, it was, I lived on the beach in Hawaii when I was younger.
Wow.
And I would just walk down the beach, and it was, it'd be dark. You'd see that the moon would follow you wherever you walked on the water. The stars abounded. And sometimes I'd just be struggling with something, often probably homework or whatever it was. But I'd go out there and just, it would just, the peacefulness and something would just come to me. And I just have clarity, just boom, and I frankly just go run down the beach back home. I figured it out, but it was something about that was just wonderful. And Deb has a similar thing with the water also here. So anyways, I'm speaking for people, so I'll stop, but just sharing.
That's beautiful, Sim. Thanks. And it's fun when we all have similar common touchstones of the Spirit, to be able to relate to others in that way. Yeah. Thank you all for this. This was a fun little experiment, and I really appreciate the sharing. I think worship tends to be put in a box. This is what is holy in worship. We have to hear from the minister in such and such a way. I actually find this much more rich and fruitful. So getting back quickly to the sermon, I am a big fan of the show This Is Us. Does anyone else watch or like this show? Yeah. Okay. I'm seeing some yays. Wonderful. Wonderful. Excellent. Yep. This Is Us is a great show for those of you who have not yet experienced it. I just love the character development they've managed to achieve in these past 6 years, and their fearlessness in addressing certain topics like racism, adoption, body image. The show is reaching its conclusion this spring, and I'm personally doing some anticipatory grief work around losing my favorite show that's currently on TV. But anyway, I digress. This past week featured, among other things, a snapshot into the life of Beth Pearson. Beth is a strong Black woman who we see in flashbacks spent her preteen and teenage years as a very accomplished and hardworking ballerina. This is a picture from the show. At age, she was very young at this point, was in a prestigious school and was groomed for greatness. But at age 17, personal tragedy struck, and various other things happened in her life that made her give up dance completely. Now, in present day in the show, Beth is in her early 40s, and she begins to work at a dance school, mentoring dancers like she had once been. I won't spoil the story for you if you haven't seen this past week's yet, but the episode showed Beth encountering a former teacher of hers and deciding on a new path forward for herself. She says this: "I've learned that there is power in waiting in the wings, in being there for the dancers that are stars and the ones that aren't. I, for so long, had put a part of myself away, but not anymore. I know who I am, and I know what I was meant to do now. It's a gorgeous moment and a gorgeous show, and I commend it to you. In this episode, she learns a really valuable lesson. Sometimes we want to cling to the mountaintop, to the dream that comes in a certain packaging. But sometimes God nudges us down a different path, descending into the valley. Immediately after our passage for this morning of the Transfiguration, Jesus and the disciples come down from the mountain, and just a few short verses later, Jesus sends the 70 out to do the work of healing in the region. There's some challenging verses in there, and they face new adversities that they had not experienced before. Towns not accepting them, their message, but there is also exhilaration. Even the demons submit to us in your name. They come back and tell Jesus. What would have happened had Jesus allowed Peter and the others to actually stay on the mountain as Peter wished? What would have happened? What would have been their legacy? What would the church look like today, had those dwelling places been created as Peter wished for them to? If we cling to a past experience rather than using it to inform our future spirituality, we can miss the road God desires us to take. So a final takeaway for us today. When we encounter places or experiences of deep holiness, like the ones we shared about in our groups this morning, they're gifts. They're deep, deep gifts. Gifts that give over and over to us, that fill us up with feelings of deep peace and acceptance and love and energy and spirit flow. But sometimes, not always, but sometimes, they might be fleeting experiences. When I came back from my camp, I used to think it was my Christian duty to bring my camp into the world, to make the world more holy. And my teenage faith was onto something, but it was misguided, because camp isn't everyone's holy space or holy experience. What we need to allow is to have these holy people and spaces and experiences and dreams, but to allow them to transform us, to transfigure us as it did for Jesus. Jesus didn't stay on his mountain either. By working on our own spirits, we can make the world more holy, more infused with God's presence, even when life inevitably brings us to the valley. It's not about location or person or experience or practice. It's about God working through those things. There can be a tendency to idolize places like my camp, but it really was just a container for the Spirit to be at work. So when sometimes we try to return to these places and they don't have the same luster, or when the person who was holy for us changes or is not around anymore, or when the experience doesn't have the same allure, when the practice, the spiritual practice that has worked for so long, when its efficacy fades, it's not as though God is gone. God is just working through a new thing to help you become more you. And I believe our call from this passage is to be mindful of that and to be open to wherever the Spirit wishes to speak from, whether mountaintop or valley. As we enter into the season of Lent this week, as we walk down the Mount of Transfiguration and transformation and into our valleys that will lead us to the cross and the tomb, may we encounter God in both the old and the new, in all the spaces in which God wishes to reside, and most clearly within our own selves. Because when the going gets rough, it is the mountaintop experiences, the memory of them, and God's enduring presence after they are gone that will make all the difference for us in how we live and how we move and how we have our being. May it be so. In the name of God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit.